Hey guys, so after the 3 new betas, there's been a ton of significant changes to Evernight and especially Dan Heng's kits, as well as the new Lightcones and new relics. So in this video, I'll go over the new changes done during the V2 to V5 betas. Now, like with every other beta, keep in mind that this information is still subject to change until the last beta version, which should be in around 2 weeks. Starting off with Dan Heng, he got some minor buffs and debuffs to some of his percentages like most characters do during betas, but he also got a massive nerf that kinda ruins him. Anyways, during the V2 through V5 betas, his skill shield percentage got nerfed to around 66% of what it used to be. His ultimate shield percentage also got nerfed to around 66% of what it used to be, similarly to his skill, and then his follow-up attack shield percentage also got nerfed into 66% of what it used to be. So all in all, he got a nerf to his shield percentages. But when it comes to the additional base attack that his shield scales off of, that has stayed the same. He also got around the 100 more base attack, which is a really good buff considering that this is now almost a 25% increase in his attack. Not only that, but he also got 5 more speed rather than 10% more HP from his traces, which will make it so that it's a bit easier to build him how he's meant to be built. He also got his second talent reworked so that his old third talent is now integrated into it, meaning that instead of his action being advanced by 40% at the start of the battle, he'll now also get advanced by 15% and regenerate 6 energy when the bondmate attacks, which is honestly a pretty significant buff since this will increase the Soul Dragon's action value by a ton and provide him with a ton more energy. For his new third talent, it now additionally deals 1 instance of additional damage of the corresponding type equal to 40% of the bondmate's attack to the enemy with the highest current HP when enhancing the Soul Dragon through his ultimate, meaning that you'll now be able to deal a bit more damage when using his ultimate. Now, the fact that this instance of damage is considered additional damage, this means that this instance of damage won't be able to reduce toughness, and thus, the fact that it deals damage of the bondmate's corresponding type is pretty irrelevant. It also now provides a small shield to the ally with the lowest shield effect when Soul Dragon takes action, which is a pretty decent buff for sustaining. For his E1, it now gives your bondmates 3% more all-type breast pen, which is a buff, but it's not too significant. Now, for the absolute assassination of his kits, the devs made it so that the Soul Dragon's follow-up attack no longer counts as the bondmate's attack, but rather it now only counts as Dan Heng's attack, and now it only does physical damage rather than doing damage of the same type as the bondmate, which destroys the myriad of synergies he had with characters like Anaxa, who allowed Dan Heng's Soul Dragon to implant weaknesses, pretty much every break DPS character who allowed Dan Heng's dragon to reduce more toughness from the bondmate's weakness type, Kafka, who can no longer regenerate a ton more energy from the tutorial icon, Jade, who can no longer gain more stacks, E1 plus Aglaia, who can no longer gain more energy and or reduce defense faster, Acheron with her signature, who can no longer maintain her damage bonuses consistently, along with other synergies that I'm probably forgetting about. Regardless, at least the Soul Dragon is still considered the bondmate to summon, meaning that technically you should still be able to use the banana amusement set with the bondmates and get a ton of crit stats. For his E2, after Dan Heng uses his ultimate, it now increases the bondmate's additional damage by 200% of the original damage rather than increasing the bondmate's damage by 80% of his attack, since that's how it used to work before the massive nerf I just went over. And it now increases the shield effect by 200% rather than increasing the bondmate's damage by 80% of his attack again, which is pretty good for balancing out his sub DPS and sustaining capabilities. For his E4, it got butchered, since it now reduces damage taken by the bondmate by 20% instead of allowing the bondmate to ignore 12% defense, which isn't too much defense threat to begin with, but compared to this new mediocre sustaining change, it's a pretty bad nerf. Anyways, yeah, Dan Heng PT got butchered in the beta, but what about Evernight? Well, Evernight got a slight nerf to her summon, because it now spawns in with only 50% rather than 100% of Evernight's max HP, which kinda sucks, but in an HP remembrance team, this nerf isn't too significant. Her Memo Sprite skill, however, got a significant buff. It now does damage based on 50% of her max HP rather than 20%, and she does additional damage based on 10% of her max HP rather than 4% for every Memoria stack that she has, which is a 250% increase to her multipliers. Now, as of right now, Evernight is looking like the favorite child, but will she continue to get this much love? Seemingly no, since her Memo Sprite no longer consumes 1% of their HP when when using abilities, which used to synergize really well with Castris, since she wants your characters to consume HP for her ultimate, but now that synergy got taken out from her Memo Sprite talents. She also got a slight nerf to her Memo Sprite talents, since Evernight doesn't heal by 20% of her max HP when she summons her Memo Sprite. She also got her other Memo Sprite talents reworked, so that now, instead of providing Evernight with 30 energy and advancing her action by 20% whenever her Memo Sprite disappears, now, upon her Memo Sprite disappearing, it increases Evernight's speed by 10%, which is honestly a pretty bad nerf, since 20% advance forward is definitely better than 10% speed that'll be removed by her next turn. Not to mention, she also loses out on 30 more energy, which is crucial for her since her kit heavily depends on her ultimate uptime. But it also states that if the disappearance of her Memo Sprites is due to using her special Memo Sprite skill, for each point of Memoria consumed in this attack, it additionally increases Evernight's speed by 1% by up to 40 times, and where the speed boost effect cannot stack, and it's removed at the start of Evernight's next turn, which could actually be pretty good if you're able to consume enough Memoria to offset the loss of the advance forward. But this change is still not really a nerf or a buff, since you'll typically be able to give Evernight more turns than before, but you'll lose out on 30 whole energy, so this change is a bit nuanced, and it's hard to tell if this will improve or worsen her performance. Anyways, she also got another buff to her other Memo Sprite skill, so that now it deals 12% of her Memo Sprite's max HP to the primary targets rather than 5%, and it deals 6% of her Memo Sprite's max HP to the other enemy targets rather than 2.5%, which is definitely a significant buff to her skill damage, since similarly to the other increase to her multipliers, this buff is a 240% increase to her multipliers. She also gets a bit more love to her own skill, which now only consumes 10% of her max HP rather than 12% to summon her Memo Sprite, which is a minor buff for survivability and only a minor nerf for Castris' ultimate regeneration. But her skill's crit damage got another buff, since it now provides 24% of Evernight's crit damage to allies rather than just a straightforward 60% crit damage buff, which would be decent since it'll only result in around 5% more crit damage if she starts off with 200% crit damage and is then given her extra crit damage from her kits in battle. But with Sunday, along with the crit damage provided by her own kits, this change can result in around 23% more crit damage, which is definitely a good buff. For her ultimate, she got a buff to her damage, since it now does 200% of her max HP rather than 120% of her max HP, which is a 40% increase to her damage multipliers. Not only that, but her damage received by enemies got increased from 20% to 30%, which is a pretty decent 50% increase to her damage received multipliers. But her damage dealt increase to Evernight and her own Memo Sprites got decreased from 100% to 60%, which is a significant decrease to her personal DPS, but honestly, I feel like it's fine since she'll already get plenty of buffs when all is said and done. For her first talent, she got a minor buff, since it increases her crit rate buff from 30% to 35%. Now, compared to the other buff she got with her first talent, this 5% extra crit rate is extremely mediocre, since her first talent now consumes 5% of her max HP, which is far better than when her Memo Sprites used to consume only 1% of their max HP when using an ability. This new buff makes her synergize even more for Castris' ultimate regeneration and even Jingliu's ultimate uptime as well. Not only that, but she also provides 15% crit damage, which is a decent crit damage buff, which along with the other buffs she already got, equates to an overall insane buff. For her other talents, it got a combination of buffs and debuffs. It decreased the amount of Memoria you can obtain from 2 to 1, but it increased the amount of energy you can gain from 60 to 70 at the start of battle, which is slightly good for ultimate uptime and slightly worse for personal damage. But again, similarly to the other changes, these changes are a bit nuanced, so it'll be hard to tell if this will improve or worsen her performance. It also gives 5 energy alongside 1 Memoria when Evernight or an ally Memo Sprite uses an ability, which is just straight up another buff to her ultimate uptime. For her third talent, she now gives all Memo Sprites 5% crit damage for having 1 Remembrance character, 15% crit damage for having 2 Remembrance characters, 40% crit damage for having 3 Remembrance characters, which was the same amount that she got before for having 4 or more Remembrance characters, but now she gets 65% crit damage from having 4 or more Remembrance characters, which, valid, it's not too insane, but when you consider the fact that this is like her 6th buff, while Dan Heng got the majority of his value straight up yoinked from him him, I feel like it's reasonable to say that the difference between Dan Heng and Evernight Changes definitely show a bit of favoritism. Anyways, for her 7th buff, she got a crit damage buff for her E2, and that's it. Not a change to any multiplier, and not any nuance buff and debuff, just a straight up 40% crit damage buff injected into her E2. Now, thankfully, or sadly, I guess, depending on whether you care about the favoritism, she got a nerf to her E6, so that now, instead of refunding 40% of the memoria consumed when using her special Memo Sprite skill, she only refunds 30%, which is definitely a significant nerf since her kit depends on these memoria stacks so much for her personal DPS, but it could have been far worse. Anyways, for the Lightcones, Dan Heng's Lightcone got a complete rework. It now provides him with 64% attack rather than 24%, which is actually a massive buff, and they removed the shield effect boost it provides and replaced it with the healing effect, which in my opinion is definitely a better form of sustaining than just a shield effect buff, especially because healing in conjunction with shields can help you sustain damage in the long run, since you'll be able to block a substantial amount of damage from powerful attacks with your shield, but you'll also be able to heal the small amount of damage that bypassed your shield that will typically accumulate throughout the battle. For Evernight's Lightcone, its damage increase got nerfed from 48% to 30%, which is a pretty bad nerf, and it obviously got another buff, since it provides 8 energy when the wearer's Memo Sprite disappears, which isn't too insane, but still, it'll help her with her ultimate uptime even more. Onto the new relics, the Deliverer relic got a decent buff, since it now increases allies damage by 15% rather than 8%, but the Recluse relic got completely reworked, since it doesn't provide skill points anymore, but instead it provides shield strength, which makes sense since that set didn't really make sense for neither Dan Heng or Evernight, but now it's a solid option, if not the best option for Dan Heng, similarly to how the Deliverer relic is a solid option for Evernight. So in conclusion, Evernight's got a lot of changes in where she's definitely better than what she used to be, but not by substantial power creeping amounts, and Dan Heng got absolutely butchered to the point to where now he'll still be a really good sustainer if you consider the fact that he's gonna be the free units, whereas before he was low-key the best sustainer hands down outside of HP scaling teams. For the new Lightcones, Dan Heng's signature got a massive attack buff and can now heal, but the shield effect got removed, and Evernight's signature got a nerf with her damage increase being reduced and a minor buff since it now provides her with a little bit of energy. For the new relics, the Deliverer sets got a nice buff and the Recluse sets got completely reworked, so that now, instead of being viable for skill point hungry characters in pure fiction, it's viable with shield characters like Dan Heng. All in all, I think these buffs clearly show what direction the meta is going towards, since Evernight, the HP Remembrance character, got a good buff to her performance, while Dan Heng got a major nerf to his. Anyways, if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, feel free to leave it down in the comments below. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.